itself. But if people have questions, please put them in the question or question chat, whatever function we're using, and Winton will be monitoring those questions, and at the end we will do our best to answer any of those questions. Of course, I'm happy to answer any questions offline at a later time. I'll give my contact information at the end as well. But I'm gonna make a few assumptions about the audience today. For the most part, I expect everybody here has at least a working knowledge of how maple syrup is made. Some folks are going to have a very sophisticated knowledge of maple syrup and how it's made. So I'm not going to worry about too much of the specifics there, or talk about the science of sap flow and that sort of thing. But I am going to make a few comments about maple sap, because for the most part, this talk is about moving maple sap. And for those that are less familiar with making maple syrup than everybody who might be here, making maple syrup takes many, many gallons of maple sap, which is essentially like water, to be moved from maple trees that are in stands of maple trees in the woods to a place where it can be boiled, concentrated, reduced from a water-like consistency to a syrup-like consistency, and with the application of heat, also caramelization and flavor profiles are developed, which gives us the unique flavor and product called maple syrup and maple sugar. But what's important about this is that in doing that, thousands, tens of hundreds to thousands of gallons of maple syrup will be moved.
I think everybody's on.
Sorry, Matt, you just got muted there. Can you unmute yourself?
Tens of hundreds of thousands of gallons of maple syrup, of maple sap, will be moved through the sugar bush in one way or another to what we call sugar houses, sap houses, to be boiled. And it's also important to remember that sometimes in many parts of the United States and Canada, this happens in the springtime, most places. And that is oftentimes very snowy, melty snow, mud, that kind of thing, very difficult conditions, oftentimes hilly.
Do you have a
conditions, and that affects the ability and the way you're going to move maple sap.
Unmute.
So
why can't you hear?
For hundreds of years, so I'm going to talk more specifically about moving maple sap and where and how we get to plastic tubing today. So for hundreds of years, and even today, maple sap was collected in small containers like pails or buckets or even little wooden troughs or birch bark containers. And they were attached or set at the base of each tree. And you then had to physically go by hand, gather each container, move it from the tree across the landscape to a gathering tank that was often pulled by a horse or an oxen, or later tractors and sometimes people. And it was all very labor intensive. Everything was done by hand, and it was clearly extremely difficult and labor intensive and very, very tiring work, and tedious at times too, especially with snow and mud and hilly conditions. So wise people in time thought there must be an easier way, or there must be ways we can do to make this simpler. So as this little diagram shows, over time people realized and made efforts to go from gathering sap in pails to somewhat primitive wooden troughs like wooden gutters, to more sophisticated pipelines, to even more sophisticated piping systems made of metal, to what we see today, this flexible plastic tubing. And so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about how these earlier methods kind of got us to where we are today, and then more specifically about 3 individuals who were really important in the development of and introduction of flexible plastic tubing to the maple industry. So as I said a little bit earlier, pails and buckets were the way, and they're still used today, but that was the way that maple sugaring and maple sap collection happened in the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s. And those were, you know, pretty rough, pretty primitive ways of doing things. But there was some efforts as early as 1794 to start trying to move sap with some kind of pipeline system. And what we do know is in 1794, the Holland Land Company, which were Dutch land speculators in New York, had access or were given title or opportunity to develop a large piece of land or large parcels of land near Cooperstown, New York, in the Otsego, New York area. And one particular man recognized that area had lots of maple trees, and he also had strong opinions about what was at the time the cane sugar industry, which was based on the slave labor in the Caribbean region, and thought, well, you know, can we do a couple things here? Can we find a different way to make sugar that didn't require slave labor? And can we take advantage of this great maple landscape and make sugar, domestic sugar? And so a guy named Garrett Boone, put together plans on a 17-acre sugar bush to do a massive scale maple operation. And he had all kinds of wooden troughs milled. And in those particular ones, as we understand it, we don't have a lot of great description of it. They were like 2 pieces of wood put in a 90-degree angle and nailed together. And so there was a seam that wasn't really sealed very well. And they tried it for a year. And while it was a really interesting idea and they ran syrup or sap downhill from these collection points, it was really a colossal failure because almost immediately the wood cracked and warped and it leaked, and it really wasn't, it was useless. And Gary Boone wanted to try again the next year and improve his situation or his model, but his overseers, the people who had the money that were paying for this, said, no, don't waste your time, we're not going to do it again. So that first one in 1794 lasted for 1 year, but it was an early attempt at it. But then we saw that there were additional attempts at wood trough, wood pipelines, as you see in this picture on the left. This is actually a real example of one. Well, the color picture to the right is a makeshift example of what it was believed to look like. And wonderful maple collector and historian Hale Mattoon set this up in his sugar bush a few years back. But Hale later was able to actually find some antique wood troughs that were part of the Moses Sheldon and Wareham Chase patents for sap spouts, as they called them, even though it was a wooden trough system for moving sap, and that was patented in 1863. These guys were from Calais, Vermont, and somewhat successful method, but everyone was trying new ways. And this one was better than the one in New York because it was a single piece of wood. It didn't leak. It did warp, and it did have its other problems with being open to the elements and debris and things. But it was an effort to start moving this further along and improve it. Which then takes us to the next improvement, which we saw the early examples in the mid-century 1860s and continued to be used in some places into the 1950s. And these are tubular metal pipelines, and oftentimes they're called standpipe systems. And they're closed tubular pipes, and they were designed to move sap through the sugar bush from collection points to more larger storage tanks. And so they would have these individual dump spots with funnels or pails that were put on, and you would you still had pails on the trees, and you carried them from the tree to the the standpipe, the dump spot, and it would run downhill. And it was gravity, it was closed, it was effective. It had problems, but it was definitely a labor-saving device. So major movement forward in that. The picture on the left is the Horseshoe Forestry Company maple sugar operation, which was in the Adirondacks from 1896 to 1908, and is the subject of my second book. And that large sugar bush at the time had 50,000 taps, and it had a whole network of these pipes to move sap through the woods. There's other really interesting later examples that we know of, such as Fairfax Ayres, a famous maple producer in Vermont, but also Helen and Scott Nearing, that some folks, that name should ring a bell. They wrote the famous maple sugar book, which came out in the 1950s. And they had, started in the 40s, a fairly extensive standpipe system. And these pictures you see on the left and the right are Scott Nearing. On the left, he's screwing in a can for the dump spot, the dump funnel. And then you can see some other picture on the right with the nature of how their piping was laid out. And that was in Vermont, in the Jamaica, Vermont area. These photos are really interesting. They were in Popular Mechanics, an article in Popular Mechanics that featured them. The name and this sugar bush will come up again in a little bit, and we'll come back to that. But they were another early one that was making strides and trying to be more efficient in how they move sap through the sugar bush. Which then takes us to another one that is fairly famous and people are aware of in the maple world, and especially in the maple spout collecting world, and that's known as the Brower sap piping system, also known as the gooseneck tubing system. And this one is a big leap forward because it was what we would call more of a complete system, where it routed sap from the tree. It eliminated the pails and buckets and collection tanks being drawn by horses and things, and was a complete system that went from the tap all the way through laterals and main lines into gravity drawing sap down into collection tanks at the bottom of a hill, sometimes right at the sugar house. And this was a pretty special system. And like I said, collectors really love this because it's a really interesting and unique arrangement of multiple pieces. You had taps with a bit of a drop spout on them. You had what was called the gooseneck, which was a piece that connected the taps into these lateral lines. And then you had lateral lines, and then you had larger main lines, very similar to how today's plastic systems are laid out. In fact, it was a great model, conceptual model for what later became the plastic tubing systems. Although, unfortunately, it had its difficulties because it was expensive. It was a lot more expensive than just traditional taps and buckets. It was prone to freezing. It would be slow to thaw when it was suspended on wires, and so it was a little heavy. And you had to, lay it out fairly carefully because it was these interlocking pieces of metal that if you didn't do it right, where they got bumped or freezing and thawing, pulled them apart, you had to go check your main lines and everything. But overall, it did work. It just it wasn't a perfect system, but it was mass produced and used over a fairly wide area for larger sugar makers in the 1910s and 20s. The guy who invented it, William Brower of Mayfield, New York, started fiddling with it about 1905, and he patented it in 1916. And if you're interested in historic maple syrup history spots, you can visit the Brower Historical Marker in Mayfield, New York. It's a few miles north of Mayfield. You take Highway 30 out of Mayfield northeast, and then you turn north on Highway 123, and about a mile north of there you'll see this marker, and on the left was the yellow house is where Brower lived. On the right is his little stone workshop. That's what's left of it. And there was a marker right there on the road indicating that. Kind of a neat little spot if you know where to look. So what was important is that Brower his system brought things up to essentially everything was similar to early tubing systems, except it was made out of metal. And it was following World War II with the advent of important material changes that were developed to help the war effort, that plastic came on the scene. And so while this slide doesn't show plastic tubing, this shows the first real effort at applying plastics in the maple industry. So a guy named Everett Soule, who worked for the George H. Soule Company, he invented what was called the King sap bag. And they were these clear, heavy-duty plastic bags that were designed to replace metal pails and wooden pails. And they weren't disposable. They were meant to be used for a few years, but they had problems. They would crack and bust in the winter when they froze, or over time, exposure to sun. The plastic that was used in them wasn't as good. They didn't know as much about plastics then as they do today, so it would get brittle and break. But it was an attempt at putting plastic to use in the maple industry, and it helped open people's eyes to other opportunities for what plastic could do. Which takes us to the gist of this talk, which is flexible plastic tubing for the gathering of maple sap. And so now I'm going to move forward into talking about the innovators. Three particular men in particular, Nelson Griggs, George Breen, and Robert Lamb. And I'll start with Nelson Griggs because most of the time when you read or hear about the origins of maple sap or maple tubing, you are told that Nelson Griggs was the inventor. He was the first one. And so I'll talk about him first. So Nelson Griggs was an MIT educated engineer from Montpelier, Vermont, who was working for the Vermont State Highway Department as a road engineer, but he's a lifelong Vermonter. But he also worked on the side as a consulting engineer for the Bureau of Industrial Research out of Norwich University in Vermont. And the Bureau of Industrial Research was a state-funded nonprofit organization that provided professional level engineering support to Vermont industries. So it was designed to help give these guys, their assistance where needed, especially with what we might call startups today, or small things where people had ideas or they were trying to develop new ways to do things. And Griggs, at some point in time, and we don't really know how this happened or what prompted him, he got interested in maple syrup movement or maple sap movement and plastic tubing. He's not from a sugar making background. He didn't have a sugar bush, but we do know he was friends with Harry Morse from the Morse maple farm outside of Montpelier. And perhaps in conversations with Harry Morse, this was an idea that came up, and he got his interest piqued. He may have had someone from the Proctor Maple Research Farm, as it was called, the research farm back then, may have come to the Bureau of Industrial Research asking for help. We don't know really exactly where he first got interested, but what we do know is that in 1955, he did get interested enough that he put together a research plan, and they did an experiment, or they did it on an experimental basis, gathering sap at the Proctor Maple Research Center, as it is called today, Proctor Maple Research Farm, with the design that he put together. And so here's a picture of him in the center in the striped sweater. Let's see, that's James Marvin to the left, over his right shoulder. There's some other faces that folks might recognize. But they put in a number of taps, and we know a little bit about this research from the notes from the Proctor Maple Research archives about how he did things and what they did. And between March 8th and April 29th, Nelson Griggs led a series of maple experiments, and he developed they purchased tubing, but he developed these taps that they were metal taps, or with in the center it was like a metal connecting piece, as you see on the left, and then they had a plastic tip on them, which went into a 1/4 inch drilled hole in the tree, and then the other end of it, so there was this metal connector, and the other end went into the tubing, and then those were essentially laid out onto the ground and went into collection tanks down, gravity fed collection tanks a little further away. And it was pretty primitive. They didn't have a whole lot of experience on what to go off of on how to design these kind of taps, because they had to create new taps. They weren't using existing taps that you would have bought for working with pails and buckets. But they did find that it was pretty successful, and that these taps on the tubing were about twice as productive as open air taps on pails. And there's a few reasons why that may have been the case. Tubing like this can generate its own natural vacuum, even without, and I'll talk a little bit more about vacuum later on. And so that can help pull sap a little bit. Tubing like this and these closed taps at the tap hole were a little more sanitary. They eliminated some amount of the bacteria and other things that would get into sap and close up the sap hole, resulting in a reaction in the tap hole to close up the tap hole. It was also brand new equipment, so it was naturally more sanitary than older equipment that may not necessarily be as productive. But regardless, they were impressed, and they were satisfied that it was a successful technology. And then they developed more sophisticated tubing systems, where they connected the tubing itself into tees and into, so 10 trees, for example, could go into one collection point. So Griggs was impressed enough with his own work that he applied by himself, not with the university, not with the Bureau of Industrial Research. He applied for a patent himself in February 1956. And other people were satisfied enough with it that a number of Vermont sugar makers started installing the system. We don't know much about where he manufactured or how he did things that other producers could start installing it. But for example, we have a great story in the Burlington Free Press. So in April 1957, sugar maker by the name of Guy Page from Waterville, Vermont, he installed 500 taps on this system, and of his what otherwise was a 4,000 tap sugar bush, but he put up 500 of these taps. And there's a wonderful quote from him that says, one of the advantages of installing this pipeline was that you can, quote, "You can set up your pipes in February, go down to your house, drink beer till the sap runs out, then all you have to do is boil it," which was, maybe not quite exactly that simple, but it was a wonderful suggestion that it was a great time saver and labor saver. So as I said, Griggs filed this patent in 1956. However, that was not without some controversy. He was awarded the patent in 1959, but as we're going to see here shortly, there was another patent claim from a guy named George Breen and his partners at 3M, Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, who felt that they maybe had a claim on the idea before Nelson Griggs did. And I'll come back to then what happened to Nelson Griggs related to that. So next we have George Breen from Jamaica, Vermont. George Breen also was not from a sugaring background. He was an engineer as well, and he got his start in working with tubing in 1952 when George Breen and his wife Jacqueline were given the opportunity to purchase the sugar bush of Helen and Scott Nearing, who I mentioned earlier with the standpipe system. And so they bought their sugar bush. They moved from Connecticut, I believe. I have to look that up. And came with their small children to Jamaica, Vermont, and decided they were going to kind of go back to the lander and also enter into the maple business. And so the first year, the Nearings showed them how their operation worked, how their metal pipeline system worked, and learned the basics of making maple syrup in the sugar house. There's 2 sugar houses at that farm from the Nearings. And pretty quickly, George Breen realized that as helpful as the metal pipeline system was, it was still not the labor-saving device that he thought it should be. So the next year, 1953, he started experimenting with plastic tubing. So if you recall back, I said 1955 was the first year of work with Nelson Griggs's tubing system. 1953, we have George Breen purchasing 200 feet of what was called surgical blood transfusion tubing from 3M, and he developed his own little taps. It actually, the very first part of that season, he laid out this 200 feet with the conventional taps that you would I think he probably used the sole type taps, and attached that to tubing, and he found that was pretty successful. He then purchased another 1,000 feet of tubing in 1953 later in the season, and had a number of taps milled, little aluminum taps milled locally from his own design. And I think that's what you see here on the left, where he's tapping them in, and then the tubing inserted into the tap, didn't go around it. And he was pretty excited about how it was working. One of the things he did, his son told me in an interview that in drilling one of the tap holes, he put a pressure gauge, attached a pressure gauge to it somehow, and realized that there was a pretty significant amount of pressure coming out of the tree. And he contacted Dr. Jim Marvin at University of Vermont and was excited and said, wow, this is really cool. Did you know this? And Jim Marvin said, of course we know that. That was old news. That was something that had been established many, many decades before by maple researchers. But for Breen, he was excited because, as he said it, but you can use that to do work for you, to move the sap. And so he just kind of, didn't think more about it. Although he did recall that Jim Marvin told him in the conversation that he had passed along his observations, and that he was doing this work with tubing. And the interesting thing is, then the next year, 1954, Nelson Griggs paid George Breen a visit. He came to his sugar bush and saw what he was doing and said, hey, I've been thinking about the same thing, although we have no indication that George Breen had done anything yet, but he was interested in it enough in 1954. He paid George Breen a visit and saw some of his work, and probably got some ideas. So these are some interesting photos I found. Actually, these have never been published anywhere. I found these this summer in doing some research in the University of Vermont archives, and pretty interesting to just see how this worked and how primitive it was. But again, this was a what might be called a ground system at first, what George Breen laid out. And there's the sugar house in the center. This picture of him holding up some of his somewhat simple plastic connectors. So one of the interesting things with George then was he was buying his tubing from 3M, and 3M got interested and was wondering, what exactly are you doing in the woods of Vermont with thousands of feet of what they considered medical grade blood transfusion tubing? And he got a phone call from 3M, and they were curious about it. And he says, I don't want to talk to you about it, because he was feeling a little bit burned, because this would have been 1956. And so he had heard about Nelson Griggs's experiment and felt like he wasn't going to tell anybody anymore about what he was doing, because he had his own ideas about things and what he might do with it. And he didn't want to share. Well, his unwillingness to share and his use of all this tubing interested the folks at 3M, so much so that in the spring or the early sugaring season, 1956, one of the vice presidents of 3M literally paid him a visit. So George Breen's out in the woods working on his tubing, and a guy in a three-piece suit comes snowshoeing out into the woods saying, "I want to talk to you. Are you George Breen?" And so George showed him his work and what he was doing. And the guy's name was Irwin Brown. And right then and there, Irwin was entranced by this whole thing and said, "Let's work together. We can patent this. We can improve this, and 3M can use their might and their resources to make this a workable product." And they did, and it became they changed the design a bit and came out with what they called Maple Flow, a Maple Flow brand sap gathering system. So it became commercially available in the fall of 1957 for use in the 1958 sugaring season. And George Breen got his name on the patent with one of their other engineers, and they had an agreement, George Breen and 3M. So it called for Breen to travel around the state, and he was the primary salesman person demonstrating this new system. And he had a contract with them that rewarded him 5% commission on sales. And soon after, when sales reached 500,000 units, which were sold at $1 a spout, 3M opted instead to they weren't so sure it was going to be that successful, I think, and they opted instead to offer Breen a lump sum of $25,000, which he accepted. So these are some images from the patent that Breen and another gentleman with 3M developed. And for the most part, once they patented it, they didn't change their design much at all. It had this kind of ribbed knobs where you inserted the plastic tubing over it. The tap itself would go into the tree, or the spile, as we call it, the plastic spout went into the tap hole, and it was tapped in, and that was kind of the anchor. And the tubing then was stretched from tree to tree, and those things were the same tubes were what we would call today lateral lines, which then were connected with other fittings that went into larger lines as more and more taps were connected through various laterals, and those went by gravity down to collection tanks. This is an interesting line or design, because today we've learned a little bit more about how tubing works with other designs, and this was what we would also call a closed or unvented system, which that had great value because it helped develop natural vacuum a little bit stronger, and I'll talk about that a little bit more related to the next individual. What's interesting is, so we have this patent here, and I mentioned that Nelson Griggs had a patent that was a little bit earlier. What was kind of an interesting bit of the story is that according to Breen and 3M, they felt that Nelson Griggs stole some of the ideas, or they felt they could prove that George Breen had developed some of these ideas a little bit earlier. And in patent law, the ideas of priority with your idea, if you can demonstrate that, is pretty important. And 3M was particularly aggressive in defending this. They had a lot more resources. They had a lot more, Nelson Griggs was just this guy kind of operating by himself. 3M was, I would even say, was especially aggressive about this. And even though this was not really a significant moneymaker and was of little significance in the larger picture of all the products that 3M made, they still decided that they were going to be the leaders in tubing. And so much so that according to various ways of looking at the story, as I was told, that I talked to Nelson Griggs' daughter, and I talked to George Breen's sons, and I also read George Breen's memoirs. And the way essentially goes was that 3M applied its corporate muscle and threatened to challenge Griggs's patent. And they offered Griggs a cash settlement of $5,000 if he would if he would agree not to challenge their patent or do any kind of counter patent claim, and would cease to develop technology like this. And he took it, and he never was. So then Nelson Griggs was never involved in plastic tubing development again, and that was the end of his story. And then the 3M product continued to be developed and sold as one of the first 2 commercially available plastic tubing systems through about the 1980s. George Breen, here's a few pictures of examples of the the maple flow system. It was notable in it. Most of it was red, very, very recognizable. And then you see these tubes, 2 different sizes of tubing, lateral lines, and what the thicker one would be called main line. And they had this black striping on them. The black striping was an idea that Jackie Breen, George Breen's wife, came up with to what the idea was. They thought it would help heat up tubing, because sometimes the tubing would have sap in it, and then at night it would freeze, and then it had to thaw out, and it wouldn't let the sap flow if it was a frozen line. The idea was putting the black stripes on it would help them heat up faster and keep it from freezing. Well, it worked too well sometimes, and maybe he would heat the sap up a little bit too quickly and cause it to spoil more quickly than people had anticipated. But they invented the tubing. They did the forming of the plastic, molded plastic spouts and tees and connectors, and lots of marketing, lots of brochures and other things, and sales efforts in that regard. George Breen stuck with it for a few more years. He continued to operate his sugarbush through 1963, and then sold the farm that used to be the Nearings as well, and pursued some other business ventures, real estate in particular, and didn't really have much more to do with the maple industry after that. Which then takes us to the next fella, Robert Lamb, Bob Lamb, one of the very famous man in the maple history of 20th century maple industry. But interesting with him as well, he didn't have a maple background. He was a guy who was involved in chainsaw sales and small engine, marine engine sales and repairs, but he was an inventor and a troubleshooter and a person with a very creative mind. And he definitely put it to use in this story. So according to Fred Winch, the former Cornell University maple specialist, Lamb's entry into the plastic tubing world began in 1955, when one of his chainsaw sales agents came to him and said he had a guy named Dick. The sales agent was named Dick Howard, and he was also a Cornell University extension forester. He came to Bob Lamb and said, "I was noticing one of my customers was using plastic pipeline, like what we might consider like today's PVC pipe, to try to rig up a system to go from his taps in his trees to buckets on the ground." And it was sort of working, but he realized that there's got to be a better way, and that he knew that flexible plastic tubing existed, but there was no system for the maple industry. So he came to Bob, knowing that Bob was the kind of guy that liked to challenge and liked to troubleshoot, and said, "What do you think, Bob? Can we come up with something better?" And they did. So the two of them came up with, on the left side, Lamb's natural flow tubing. It wasn't called natural flow in the first few years. I'll mention that in a little bit. But they came up with their own prototype system. And so Dick Howard and Bob Lamb first introduced this in 1956, in the spring of 1956, on the New York State Maple Producers Annual Tour. And they showed it, they displayed it. it wasn't used in any extensive way, but the idea was being shared. And Bob, as people know about him, was a guy that never stopped trying to improve things, and he always kept making little tweaks and little changes. And so soon enough, he had a more operable system. So by late 1957, his system was, completely intact and was offered for sale for the 1958 season. Same timeline as the Maple Flow season of the 3M product I talked about from George Breen. So they're all right on the same timeline. So this was sold by A.C. Lamb and Sons, which was Bob Lamb and his brother Clifford's business. A.C. Lamb was their dad, and so they continued to operate the business started by their father, which was this marine engine and chainsaw business. But this was a new venture that they started to operate out of New York. So it did well, and they continued to grow, and eventually A.C. Lamb broke into two different businesses, and Bob Lamb and his wife Florence decided that they were going to focus on maple products and maple tubing as their full-time business, and they left for the most part the chainsaw and the marine business behind, and created their own business called R.M. Lamb. And then he named his product Natural Flow. So you had Maple Flow from 3M, you had Bob Lamb's Natural Flow system, which came out in 1958. In 1959, he started calling it Natural Flow. So the pictures in the center and the right here are early examples of his tubing and his fittings and his spouts. You'll notice on the left, it's all one color and kind of more simple, kind of crude looking, whereas the middle and the right, you have the blue and the white and the red plastic pieces that are connected with the tubing of different sizes. And that's kind of the signature system that Lamb came out with in the very beginning. Bob didn't get into the patent wars with Nelson Griggs and George Breen and 3M. He didn't, even though his product was developed in 1956, he did not submit a patent and get a patent until into the 1960s. In fact, what he did get patents for isn't even the main components people were most familiar with his product. He didn't, for example, the spouts you see, the blue spouts in the center, they're white on the right side. Those were kind of a signature design. He didn't bother patenting those, probably because he realized it wasn't worth the effort, because these guys were already ahead of the game, and it wasn't going to get him anywhere, and he wouldn't have much chance in protecting something against 3M as well. The Lamb system was what was called a ground system. So it was different than the 3M system, which the 3M system, the tubing was actually elevated as it was stretched between each tap, whereas the Lamb system had these what are called nowadays drop lines, where the connection from the tap to the tree went down to a lateral line, and then it was laid on the ground, which it was something that was experimental, and even though Bob Lamb really thought it was the way to go, it proved difficult because it would get buried. The tubing would get buried by the snow. It would freeze. It would be difficult to thaw out. It would be difficult to dig up if you had to, if there were repairs that needed to be made. But the drop line as was later proven to be a good innovation. But one of the problems with the Lamb system was that it was a vented system, unlike the Maple Flow 3M system, which was a closed system. So the vented system allowed air into the tubing with the idea, according to Bob Lamb, that it would help prevent a vapor lock that would happen. And natural gravity on these tubing systems, as things flowed downhill, would develop in the tubing, and as the gravity pulled through, what was called a vapor lock or a vapor compression would because the tubing was soft plastic, it would close it up and it would stop the flow. And Bob thought an open system would be better to help airflow through, but it was later proven that with research at Proctor and other places, that you needed to have a closed system to be more effective. And then as people added external vacuum, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit, you had to have a closed system because you couldn't maintain or build a vacuum pressure if there was an open air system. But Bob was an interesting guy, as some folks who may remember him that are on here and or have heard about him. He was a very aggressive salesman. He was very, very strong of opinion and vocal. He took advantage of his opportunity to reach people and spread his word and the gospel, according to Bob, through use of paid advertisements and other platforms like the Maple Syrup Digest. He was a big supporter of it, but he also knew how to use it very well to his advantage in getting his word out and defending his ideas, sometimes even if they were later proven to be less than supportable. Here's some pictures of some of the lamb fittings and pieces that I mentioned earlier. Picture in the upper right shows lambs. He made his own tubing. So he actually purchased an extruder and built a barn for it. And it's kind of a crude picture. We don't have great pictures of it, but he not only, he had the fittings made elsewhere, but he made his own plastic tubing. So he would actually have that thing running night and day, sometimes making thousands and thousands of feet of tubing, which is pretty amazing. And it was pretty much a family operation. He and his wife did most of the work. Sometimes a son or a nephew, I believe, helped out. But he was different, and his operation was different than 3M's, as I kind of alluded to. I mean, he was 100% full-time Maple Products guy. 3M, this was just one minor thing that wasn't really making any money for them. So they kind of, and they didn't tweak their design, whereas Bob was always trying to improve it. And he was working with the industry, and he would go to all the meetings, and he became a major player and influential person in the industry. So he had a very different connection and how his tubing was sold and respected and otherwise. You know, it was the big 3M corporate guy versus just Bob and Florence Lamb, and he worked hard and people respected that. But these weren't the only guys. There were also some other people who made efforts at testing out and trying plastic tubing. Unfortunately, none of them went into things commercially, and we don't know a whole lot more about what they did. For example, Chester Wilson in Rock Springs, Wisconsin. It was an area of Sauk County, Wisconsin. We have referenced that he put nearly 2 miles of plastic tubing up on 400 trees in 1955. And I have one newspaper account that suggests that as early as 1952, he was experimenting with plastic tubing, but he never did anything to promote it with other people or sell it or develop it. It was just, he wanted to improve his own sugarbush operation. And so he put up plastic tubing and did it for about 10 years before he got out of the maple business entirely. Another fellow, Basil Hummer, I love that name, in Titusville, Pennsylvania. In as early as 1955, he was tapping trees using tubing, and he was said to have 7,000 feet of tubing on his trees. Again, just for his own operation, didn't necessarily try to make it into a commercial thing. A guy named George Butler in Jacksonville, Vermont. His story was interesting because he had 3,000 taps connected on surgical plastic tubing, and there was a few newspaper articles about him talking about this, and you know, he was all excited that this was the future. Well, he got frustrated. He didn't think, in the end, he gave it up. 1960, a few years later, he said, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. It's just as much work as collecting with pails and things. And so for whatever reason, either his system wasn't well enough designed or the technology hadn't advanced enough for him, that he decided it was actually counterproductive, whereas other people probably would have disagreed. Everett Soule, as I mentioned earlier, who did the plastic bags, he also invented and patented a tubing system with using flexible plastic tubing and spouts, but he never did any further, even though he had the Soule company, he didn't do any further development and promotion of it. So whatever reason, he got the invention out, but he didn't put it together as something he could sell and develop, even though he had a pretty significant maple products company. So those three guys were, those were the ones that really got it going and are famous for developing plastic tubing that we know and people love today. I mean, it proved to be a practical and efficient and a cost-effective way to gather maple sap, but it also presented new questions and new problems. It was discovered that with the assistance of gravity on a downhill slope would naturally create vacuum in a closed tubing system, and that was really good because it would pull sap. And as we know now, vacuum at a tap hole does all kinds of wonderful things that don't happen with an open system, open air system like a tap with a bucket. And you can get longer, more flow out of the sap hole. You have more control over a sanitary situation, and it has other enhancements of outward flow of the sap through tubing lines and clearing the lines. Knowing about that, with that knowledge, sugar makers then and researchers said, well, if natural vacuum is a good thing and it increases the overall production of sap over the season, can we enhance that? Can we even add more vacuum? And so people started adding what you could call external vacuum. So you would put a vacuum system onto these tubing lines and create even more vacuum. And vacuum is important because the idea is you have a differential pressure. Trees have more pressure than the atmospheric pressure, so they push the sap out. If you drop the atmospheric pressure even more by creating vacuum, dropping it down even further inside the tubing, you get even greater flow of sap. And so people started putting vacuum onto the plastic tubing. You couldn't do vacuum without the tubing, really. It wouldn't be an effective way. But I'm not going to go beyond that about the vacuum. That's a whole nother story, the inventions of vacuum and how that developed and that introduces, it's a very interesting story. It introduces a whole Canadian element to this. And interestingly enough, for whatever reason, I was not able to find evidence of much experimentation with early plastic tubing in Canadian sugar bushes or with Canadian researchers in the 1950s. It all seemed to have been a largely American based endeavor. But the work with vacuum was things happened in the United States and a lot of things happened in Canada. But that's a topic and a history for another day. But another interesting thing about this story too is that the folks that developed it weren't your usual suspects, so to speak. They were engineering-minded folks coming from outside the maple world largely, but they collaborated with places like Proctor Maple Research Center and the Cornell Forester and the Bureau for Industrial Research, and so it wasn't folks working completely in a vacuum, are there? Pardon that pun, but it was this collaboration, and then 3M. Sometimes it's a corporate thing, but other times it's not. So it's an interesting bit of history where people from various backgrounds came together to really, further this for the industry. So that's the gist of it. To recap, and before I go there, this is something I really love. This is a really cool tubing history display. If folks ever get a chance to go to the International Maple Museum Center in Krogan, New York, this is all one unit, and it folds up and it's portable, but it's on display. It was invented or put together from the collection and fabricated by Mike Gerard a great maple sugar guy and great collector, and it really puts all of this on display. So you've got Nelson Griggs, you've got George Breen, you've got Bob Lamb, and some other later tubing that came out into the 60s and 70s and 80s. But it's a wonderful display, and I can't help but promote it because I thought it was fabulous, especially as a way to kind of see this all in one place at one time. But to sum up or to recap, the invention and introduction of flexible plastic tubing was the result of a desire to find more efficient methods to gather maple sap and gather more efficient than pails and gathering tanks and the evolution of, and it was a result of the evolution of sap gathering technology with the addition of new and improved materials, namely plastic. So from wood troughs to tubular metal pipelines with dump stations onto the more efficient Brower gooseneck tubing system that went from tap hole to tank, the groundwork was laid, and that's how plastic tubing came to be as we have it today, with the additions of these new unique material properties that plastic presented, with the flexibility and the lightness and the cost, and then also easily molded plastic for spouts and fittings. It all came together to become the plastic tubing systems we see today. And without the work of Nelson Griggs and George Breen and Bob Lamb, who we had to thank, we wouldn't have the kind of tubing system that the industry completely relies on today, and really couldn't operate without tubing like that today. So that's the talk. I'm happy to take some questions. Hopefully we have a few, and I'll see if I'm able to answer them. And here is some contact information if folks want to reach me, and also find my website. It has a variety of maple history topics, way beyond this, as Winton mentioned at the beginning. But I'm always also open for suggestions and ideas and questions that folks have on topics to research as well. But for now, let's talk about tubing.
Thanks for that, Matt. That was a lot of information in there. Folks, if you're familiar with using Zoom, there's a button on the bottom that says chat, and that'll open up a window that will let you type in questions. So you should feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm going to start out with a question that occurred to me while you were talking, Matt. You made it sound easy, and I'm curious if you learned anything about attempts at using, whether it was materials or different designs that failed, and what those might have been like.
That's a good question. And the short answer is, folks don't tell you about their failures as much as we want to know, because I agree, that's fascinating. And I don't have a whole lot really to say. Like I mentioned, the fellow butler in Jacksonville who gave up on it in the late 50s in southern Vermont. I think his failure was not necessarily, I guess I don't know exactly, but I think he felt like he was having squirrel problems, for example, eating through his tubing and leakage and those kinds of things. Those are problems that people still have to this day, but they were working on overcoming as they developed that. I do know that, for example, there were failures that people needed to overcome with the nature of plastic. For example, it would get the formula and the kind of plastic that was available, and the formula that was being used to make flexible plastic tubing was in its infancy, shall we say. And so they had to, there were issues with flexibility and brittleness and exposure to the elements. Oh, one thing I didn't mention. So in these early systems, they took them down every year. And so this was a fascinating thing, which I just find amazing, because the idea, because they didn't really figure out some of these things until later, was that they had to be taken down, because that's what you did. You took it down, you washed everything, you stored it, you put it back up again. Well, folks later learned, and there's other kind of realities to things that they later learned, is that, I mean, as much as tubing systems now are installed and left up, they are also semi-disposable. They're not meant to last for forever. And so you put them up, you leave them up, they do get, for lack of a better term, dirty over time. And and I don't like to say that, that's maybe a bad way to describe it, but they do develop residues, and they do keep, hold on to some of the microbial residue and activity that happens, and it makes them less productive, and then they need to be disposed of over time. But people also learn through the kind of the cost benefit that you can leave them up and not have to worry about the labor of taking them down, and you will dispose of them and replace them in a 5 or 10, or some people want 15, 20 years. But there were, and it's not really answering your question, but there was things that people learned over time on how to further make it more effective and cost-effective system. But yeah, the short answer is I didn't find a lot of this evidence about what was abandoned, what technology. I think most of it had to do with materials and tweaking the designs on fittings. And people I haven't been able to find a lot of preserved records from designs that were on the cutting room floor. But it's amazing. I keep finding new things in odd places, so maybe I'll find some more stuff. Especially Bob Lamb, he did lots. Like I said, he tweaked his design, so that's the good thing, is that he kept, changing things and trying new things, and so there is going to be records of maybe a rejection and other things. But
few questions in the chat. First one is from Tom, asking if you have any information on U.S. maple.
They were later. I mean, I wouldn't yet. The short answer is yes, but I don't put them into this category because they were a later. They weren't part of one of the early initiators. They came around as, I would say, the second wave, and there were others in the second wave. So the short answer is yeah, and I can tell you what I have, Tom, but it's not as much a part of this origin story. So.
Mike from West Virginia asks about, he says he remembers working with tubing with a square exterior shape. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so I can't remember the name of it. I can look it up. I might even have a piece of it on my shelf. But it was a little bit later. They experimented with these ridged tubing, and some of it it kind of made it into a square shape. And there was different folks trying different kinds of tubing. I got, there was an interesting recent bit of information from Mark Ware in Somerset County, Pennsylvania, and I think he's on here tonight about the Somerset County maple producers using plastic tubing and developing with a local developer of manufacturer of tubing, their own tubing. So it was something they just kind of did locally, and it wasn't commercially marketed or anything, but they just took it upon themselves to work with a local pharmaceutical equipment producer, and they got their own tubing made, and which, I didn't know that was, and there's really not a whole lot written about it. So there's little things like that people figure out their own thing and do it their own way and take care of their own sugar bushes. But there's lots of little stories like that out there.
Another question, this one more about the mechanicals. Were the pressure differentials used in the systems to augment the flow of sap ever great enough to cause problems with collapsing of the plastic tubing? Again, that's probably one of those things that came up early on in their experimental stage, but did you hear anything about that? Yeah, I mean,
yes. So with these natural gravity systems, natural vacuum would happen, and it would collapse the tubing. That's exactly what happened. And so that's where they were trying side-by-side experiments, for example, with a vented system versus a closed system, to see which one was more effective and which that didn't happen with. Also with just even how much slope you had sometimes, size of the tubing. So they did recognize this and experiment in those early years to try to alleviate that, because sap tubing collapse was a problem, and with natural vacuum on these open and closed systems. And once you got into the added vacuum, the external vacuum, that kind of changed things. They learned how to control the whole system a lot better with that.
Something that someone added some historical information that you may already have about the DeVilbiss Company in Somerset, Pennsylvania, making tubing in the mid to late 60s.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about with Mark Ware and Somerset County folks. That's the name of the local pharmaceutical equipment company. Yep.
Okay. And a question about George Carey using the Brower SAP system.
Mm-hmm. He did. Is there a specific or just in general?
Just
so
that.
Yeah. So George Carey, he not only used it, he manufactured it, or I should say, he brought William Brower from Mayfield, New York, to St. Johnsbury, and the Carey Company, in partnership with William Brower, mass-produced the metal gooseneck Brower system. Carey also used it in his own sugar bushes actually, in North Danville, and he had thousands of trees on the Brower system, and was a big advocate and promoter of it. And Brower physically moved his family to St. Johnsbury for a few years in the early 1920s. And I even have a sales booklet from the George Carey William Brower gooseneck manufacturing company. I mean, Carey was all on board with that.
And a question from David that, relates to, we all deal with this, that the sap freezes and thaws throughout the season, and that obviously puts different kinds of pressure on the tubing. And so do you have a sense of the longevity of the earlier kinds of tubing that were out of the plastic that was out there?
I don't have a really good sense. That's a good question. I think my best way to describe it, I think that tubing was prone to getting brittle during over the course of the season or a year, with the exposure to sunlight, UV, and also freezing and thaw, just the air temperatures in general, because of the nature of the formula of those plastics. And I don't think that they turned rock hard right away, over the course of one season necessarily, but they didn't have a whole lot of longevity. And then there was later problems of some of them being too soft and stretching, and that became there was either they're too firm and too brittle, or they're too soft. And when you're stretching these lines, that becomes an issue, and freezing and thawing, depending on the formula of the plastics, could also be a factor. And so over those first, you could say 15 years or so of tweaking these formulas and ideas, that those kinds of things were issues. But as far as say freezing and thawing and bursting lines, I don't know much of that happening overall. But the thing that's interesting is some of these early ones, the nature of this research is it's hard to get some answers to things that happened 70 years ago. Folks remember some things, but they don't remember, what happened. How many years did you use your tubing, if you ask somebody? Or, what did you just throw it away? Did you, how did you kind of do an after action report and see what happened with that? Was that, these guys were sort of scientifically minded with their engineering approaches to things, but on the other hand, we would have lots more questions today from a scientific point of view than they were necessarily applying to things. But
question, do you see anywhere we could look back to use an untapped resource of the past for future development? And where do you see the future development going in light of past and current developments? So for a historian, asking you to look forward, maybe,
you're throwing me a big one. Okay. Well, boy, I guess one thing I think of as a really fascinating area, and I think this is important for the industry, and that's to think about and look at packaging, for example, in the past, and helping create the maple product, the uniqueness to the maple product. And there is some of this happening, but there's also, I think, room for a lot more creative and wider variety of packaging. So we have, the usual syrup cans, and we have the plastic containers that everybody buys, and it's something of a cost limitation, but there's a room for coming up with other new and interesting ideas. So like the new can, the metal syrup can that looks like a barrel, that's shaped like a barrel, that's kind of new. It's attractive. It gets people's attention, and it's kind of unique. And instead of like letting the log cabins of the world or whatever co-opt the packaging of the maple industry needs to, I'm preaching now, but maybe could look at packaging of the past and not necessarily try to copy it, but learn from, even learn back from the log cabin. Their success was partly related to their unique cabin shaped can. Well, now, what can the maple industry do to continue to stand out? And that's maybe easy for me to say, but you can learn from the past sometimes by seeing how things were successful, and what was unique about that is forgotten or overlooked today. But that's a really big question, and I'll think about it some more, because there's always really interesting things in that regard. But
Can follow up with a much simpler question. What year were tubing systems first commercially available?
1958.
I'm curious, with the early ones, when you find old systems or old bits of tubing, was there more patching going on? With metal ones that were on the ground, for instance, or even from some of the early ones, were they splicing like we would do now when they had holes or wildlife
that's a good
damage?
question. Yeah, I mean, like with the metal ones, I wouldn't say that there was splicing. I mean, it would come apart and you put them back together. I mean, there were times where, the metal in some ways was more durable, so it wasn't as prone to like pinhole leaks or other things like that, or being damaged by trees and critters and deer or whatever, like plastic. But I don't know with any authority that these systems, how people manage them, as far as because they were taking them down and putting them back up each year, almost by that very nature, they were making mistakes and splicing and rearranging, versus the systems that stay up permanently and need constant care and attention and splicing to fix. So that by nature of how they installed and managed them, it's a little bit different anyway. But
Any last questions from folks in the audience, either in the chat, or if you feel inspired to unmute yourself and ask a question out loud?
And feel free to contact me off, line. I'm happy to chat about any things that come up after the fact that people think about too.
All right, I think folks might be ready for supper at this point. So, well, thank you, Matt. This has been fascinating. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Matt's work, I would encourage you to check out maplesyruphistory.com. He also writes a regular column in the Maple Syrup Digest, which hopefully you all get. And with that, we can call, someone's unmuted themselves. David Harris, do you have a question?
Enjoyed it, Matt.
Thanks, Woody.
I see. It's one of your groupies.
You bet.
Well, thanks everybody. That was a lot of fun, and I'm really honored to be able to talk to you all tonight. So,
thanks everyone. Have a good night.
good night.
Good night. Good night, Matt.
Good night.
Say good night, Michael.
Yeah, good night, Matthew.
Good night, Dad.